Welcome to part 2, Alana Linton. In this video we're going to talk about the way in which this demand for freedom of speech, the rejection of political correctness, the denial of racism functions as a way of hiding racism within itself, right? Keeping racism from being pointed out. In particular, we see from Indigenous Australian philosopher Eileen Morton Robinson in her book White Possessive, Power, Property, and Indigenous Sovereignty, that this demand to speak freely and to determine the nature of the debate on race and the meaning of what racism is, the definition of it, is, these are her words, the demand that folds white supremacy within itself. Remember that for quizzes. She says, just as whiteness presents itself as a normality, so too the demands white people call for are presented as neutral. Right? These are just neutral, honest issues. So what this does is it doubles down on the discursive violence of white supremacy, right? By the neutrality of the concept of whiteness itself within the framework of race, in other words, a racial hierarchy, and the demands for those discussions to be seen as neutral is a kind of folding of white supremacy into itself. Now, where we see this show up, particularly in this essay that we want to discuss, is not only the popular culture notions of racism, that racism is something that requires hate, requires a form of irrationality, fear, not honest, not rational, but something that is sort of hateful and fearful and irrational, right? But also in the definitions of racism that are in philosophy itself. So in the next video, we'll look at a couple of those theories and see how they connect to this thing that is called the Miri song worry. So what is the Miri song worry? So this comes from an essay by Miri Song, 2014, that's referenced in the article. And in that article, Miri Song articulates a worry about the definition of racism that creates false equivalencies of racism. Because these definitions of racism make almost any form of racial statement racist. Like we talked about in the OU Daily, when the discussion about BERT, just the notion of a black emergency response team, a lot of people said was racist because it had black in it, right? So any kind of mention of race or any kind of racialized discussion is a form of racism. Mentioning any individual racial attribute is racism. What this does is it creates this kind of trivialization and homogenization of any kind of race talk is racism. What this does is creates a framework of false equivalencies that whereby sort of reverse racism, as we call it, is the same as racism. So a kind of discussion about whiteness is just as racist as a discussion about blackness. Now, what Miri Song says in this essay that's referenced in Alana Linton's essay is that the concept of racism can't be understood in the wholly abstract formulaic way, divorced from the lengthy history in which beliefs and practices about racial inferiority and superiority emerged and were consolidated. That's a quote from page 3 of Alana Linton's essay from Miri Song's 2014 essay. Now, we have the tools from what we've studied in this course so far to critique these sort of flat or false equivalencies of racisms, because we understand that racism is not something that is just any kind of discussion of race. The very concept of race itself comes out of this framework of Eurocentric tautology that later becomes white supremacy. The very idea of race itself is already racist, right? And that's a part of the history, the genealogical construct of race itself. So that's kind of a part of the Miri Songwari, that she's saying that these articulations of racism as a notion, philosophically or otherwise, in this flat kind of way, are missing this historical dynamic. They're not understanding how race came to be in the first place, much less racism. They're just kind of trying to make it a generic sort of thing.